Welcome to the July 2013 Dallas Camera Club Projected Competition. Our theme this month is Open. Our judge this month is Michael Clements. Michael's photography career started and almost ended on a Friday evening in October during the heyday of Tri-X and Kodachrome. His high school yearbook editor handed him a twin-lens Minolta autocord and said, "We need shots of the game and no one else is here." After 15 invigorating and mostly prosperous years as an award-winning photojournalist with several Texas newspapers, Michael made the jump to freelance photography in 2004. Michael specializes in sports, news, and advertising photography. His clients include universities and newspapers, along with Getty Images, AP, and ESPN. He has had photos published in the New York Times, Sports Illustrated, and ESPN, the magazine. Beginners Projected. I Lost My Head by Aaron Lesher. I like the whimsical nature of this image. It made me smile. This image seems very flat to me, both in depth and color. There isn't any separation between the foreground, subject, and background. A larger aperture, f2.8 or f4 instead of f16, would help separate the distracting background elements from the subject. 9 points. I Wonder Why by Evan Simmons. There are many visual elements to ponder in this image. The guitar, the tattered pants, the blue bags. It's making me wonder why too. I want to know how this guy got to this point in his life. The overexposed wall to the right of the subject really needs to be toned down. It draws attention away from the relevant elements in the image and emphasizes the contrasty nature of the image along with the lack of detail in the shadows. I realize this is probably a rushed grab shot captured without the subject knowing he was being photographed. I can accept the value of documenting the moment, but this type of imagery has become quite the cliché. 9 points. Tea Ceremony by Delise Foglia. This image is well lit and carefully composed. The lighting is terrific. The horizon line is tilted. I believe a tighter crop would eliminate a few of the distracting elements such as the door frame behind the woman and the linear elements to the lower right corner. 10 points. American Promise by Julie Horak. This image definitely grabs my attention. How about a less tight composition? After I figured out how all the visual elements were connected, I wanted to read the entire promise. I'm not quite sure how to look at the image. Should I view it as a photograph? Is it line art? 10 points. Winging It by Michael Farnham. The composition or crop is lovely. The warmth of the image is pleasant. The image is over-sharpened, creating a thin but obvious halo around the bird's head and tail. A faster shutter speed would have eliminated the motion blur and perhaps the temptation or need to over-sharpen. 10 points. Glow by Spencer Parker. The photographer has captured the brilliant warmth of the balloons and fire. It's a tricky exposure that's handled well enough. The tilted horizon and odd color of the sky are distracting. I think the image could be improved dramatically by a shorter exposure, a much tighter crop, and perhaps a vertical portrait composition. This is a great situation to experiment with a tripod and different exposure settings and compositions. 10 points. Railroad Trestle by Judy Lindo. I like the colors and textures in this image. The manipulation of the image adds a gritty, processed look and feel to the image. I prefer a horizon line that isn't tilted. Although I can appreciate the time and effort put forth to create an image like this one, I generally do not like highly manipulated photographs. I tend to be a photo purist or a snob, but having said that, I cannot talk myself out of liking this particular image. I like the colors and composition. I think this one would look great hanging large on a gallery wall. 11 points. Night Scene by Kwan-Soo Lee. The thoughtful composition and fine details in the trees and reflections are strong. A tighter crop centered on the upper right third of the image to emphasize the trees and reflections and parts of the image with fine details would help. Ditch the auto modes in a situation like this. I like the overall composition, but the lack of shadow detail in the foreground really bugs me. experiment with manual exposure and light painting, or perhaps the built-in HDR and bracketing features in your D600 to bring out the foreground details. 11 points. Stunning by Chris Cobos. Technically, this is a wonderful shot. The photographer nailed it. The image is well lit and properly exposed. It has a pleasantly balanced composition, and I suppose I'm partial to an image of a beautiful woman in a skin-tight animal print dress. Although this is technically a very nice photo, it is not particularly impressive or creative or difficult to achieve. Anyone with event access and a modern Digicam can get canned photos like this. For a contest photo, I'd rather see an engaging portrait that has challenged the photographer, an image that establishes a relationship between the photographer and the subject and viewer. 12 points. Is It For Me? By Jim Stump. I like the depth and layered look of this image. The color is great. Perhaps a tighter crop to eliminate the pink mailbox on the right and the colored pickets to the left. 12 points. Sunset in the Cemetery by Penny Clark. This is a well-lit, carefully composed image. The backlight sunset is controlled very nicely, and the layering of the photo is effective. The subject is thoroughly isolated from the background. The model's hair, makeup, and clothes look great. It's obvious that a fair amount of thought and planning went into this shoot, but the subject looks bored and tense. One of the lessons of portraiture that I've had to learn over and over again is that the expression trumps everything else in the photo. I might not pay close enough attention to the person's face and body language in the portrait because I worked so hard to nail the lighting, composition, focus, and other technical aspects of the shot, but facial expression and body language are things the viewer will always see first. 12 points. Dallas by Barbara Briley. I like the murkiness and graininess of the image, perhaps a tighter composition and darker, moodier sky. 13 points and honorable mention. Light Rail by Doug Daly. Thoughtful composition emphasizes strong visual elements. I like the interaction of the sunlit shapes with the linear shadows. The arch closest to the camera is cut off and creates an orphan shape in the top right corner of the image. I'd like to see the entire curve of the arch and slightly less grass in the foreground. 13 points and third place. Gowling Bridge by David Rees. The thoughtful composition is very pleasant. I like the serene moment and the tone of the image. I can see evidence of a dirty sensor. The blemishes created on the image by a combination of a dirty sensor and stop-down lens are easily corrected in Photoshop. 13 points and second place. Evening Glow by Diane McNabb. This is a very simple image that I really like. I'm usually not a big fan of silhouettes, but this one works well. There's a very distracting dot just above the sunset. Overprocessing of the image has created a halo around the taller rock. 13 points and first place. Advanced Projected. Jana by Dave Rocher. The warmth and genuineness of the subject's expression is infectious, and I like the way she is lit. Although I really like the subject's smile, this image is spoiled by camera shake, distracting background, and Photoshop flaws. Try trading aperture for shutter speed. Try f4 at 1/80th instead of f8 at 1/20th to keep your shutter speed faster than your focal length when hand-holding the camera. Also put some distance between your subject and the background to separate your subject from the background. There is an odd double circle in the upper left third of the image along with two strange dots or highlights. It might be a sensor or pixel sight issue, or it might be a Photoshop issue. It is tremendously helpful to get the image right in camera with respect to exposure, focus, composition, background, etc. to avoid becoming dependent on image editing software to fix or repair your images. 7 points. Busy Carpenter Bees by Karen Mack. Nicely cropped image of an interesting moment. This image captures an interesting moment, but it is just too soft. I want to see the details, the hairs on the bee, for example. Also the highlights to the right of the bee and in the top corners are distracting, but perhaps the details in the image have been smeared by too much JPEG compression. Consider using your speedlight and tripod to help capture the important details in a macro shot, and be very wary of your settings when saving your images as small JPEGs. 8 points. Sand Cranes by Morris Stein. The image captures the cranes in a relaxed, natural-looking environment. The image is overexposed and suffers from camera shake. Bracket your exposures or use the plus-minus dial to back off 1 or 2 stops. Also trade aperture for shutter speed, using a speed faster than your focal length when hand-holding. A wider aperture, f2.8 instead of f11, will get you a higher shutter speed to help alleviate the camera shake. Also, the wider aperture will dramatically decrease the depth of field to help isolate the birds from the background by blurring the background. 8 points. Dancer Twirling to Music at the Addison 60th Anniversary Sock Hop by Virginia Sumrall. The image captures the concentration of the girl dancing her way across the gym floor. I'm not at all sure what is going on in the background, but the reflections, especially that U-shaped highlight, are terribly distracting. Try shooting from a lower angle, perhaps from one knee or a chair, to capture the moment from the girl's perspective, and situate yourself to eliminate those nasty background reflections. 9 points. Rusty Don Quixote by Bob Krause. Great perspective and composition. This is a tricky exposure handled well by the photographer and camera. Over-sharpening has created halos around most of the sculpture. 11 points. Alpha and Omega by Andy McCullough. This composite is an interesting take on Alpha and Omega and held my attention for quite a while. I enjoyed looking at it. The resolution of the keyhole image doesn't quite match the images placed inside the keyhole. However, the graininess and soft, cool tones of the wood and scruffy lock around the keyhole leads the eye directly into the blackness of the keyhole. 12 points. Glover's Silk Moth by Steve Reeves. This image is nicely composed with gobs of detail. The cool tone of the concrete makes the warm-toned moth really stand out. The detail in the concrete under the subject is distracting. A different background would be nice, but I understand completely that the moth might not be the most cooperative model. I would have liked to have seen the face of the moth. 12 points. Oh, This Band Has a Violin by Ashley Bischoff. Unusual Vantage creates an interesting series of shapes and lines. My eye goes straight to the in-focus carpet to the right of the violin case, perhaps a slightly different composition to put more emphasis on the namesake of the photo and less on the carpet. I really like the shapes, colors, and extra shallow depth of field in this image. 12 points. Portabella by Waylon Threadgill. Nicely detailed study of a mushroom. The image is a bit contrasty with lots of detail in both the shadows and the highlights. Try using a softbox or other diffused light source to get rid of the hard edges. 12 points. St. Francis Assisi by Reed McNabb. I like the composition, details, and textures of this image. The warm, saturated color adds to the aura of the image. The sky in the upper left of the image is distracting and competes strongly with the sky seen through the window. What about a composition that eliminates the sky in the upper left? 12 points. The Dock by Aaron Curry. This image has a wonderfully deep, layered look, anchored by the rust-colored metal in the lower left. I like that the focus is sharp from foreground to background. The tops of the dock posts get lost on the horizon line. Try a composition that raises or lowers the tops of the posts in relation to the horizon. 12 points. Minuteman by Steve Havacek. Really thoughtful composition showing the colors of fall behind an iconic American symbol. The highlights on the front of the statue and in the leaves behind the statue are a bit overexposed. Back off on the exposure to hold the detail in the highlights and to accentuate the saturated colors on the background leaves. 13 points. Waiting for You by Rachel Cook. This portrait is lovely, it's well composed and beautifully lit. The subject is separated nicely from the background. It has a velvety soft quality to it, except for her expression. The portrait is well done, but her expression keeps me from looking too closely. It makes me think I'm in a fair amount of trouble for making her wait so long. The title says a lot about the image, Waiting for You and You're in Big Trouble. That was the first thing the image said to me. If that is the mood you were trying to convey, it really comes through in the portrait. I've just taken a survey in the cafe where I'm sitting. I've asked 10 people to describe her expression. 100% describe it as upset or angry. 13 points and honorable mention. Bee Time by Jerry Martin. The more I look at this image, the more I like it. I was put off at first by the composition, but it has grown on me. I like the sharp detail of the purple flower and the working bee juxtaposed against the grainy out-of-focus background. You might consider playing with the composition or tightening the crop a bit. 14 points and third place. Oceanside Memories by Betty Johnson. Beautifully layered and composed landscape image with lots of detail and saturation. The image is busy without being overwhelming. I would love to see this image hanging big on the wall. I really like the detail, saturation, and HDR feel of this image. Don't change a thing. 14 points and second place. Tulip by Richard Stern. Deliciously clean and simple image. There are not any distracting background or foreground elements to get in the way of this delicate detail of the tulip. Composition is outstanding. 15 points and first place. Masters Projected. Mildred by Gary Kelly. A nice effort. The image has all the elements for a good portrait. Mildred's clothes are colorful and full of texture. The composition is tight. It looks to me that Mildred's face is not in focus. For a tight portrait like this one, the focus needs to be sharp at your subject's eyes, or perhaps she moved during the exposure. Trade aperture for shutter speed so that your shutter speed will be faster than your focal length when hand-holding. And the image is very flat. Put some distance between the subject and the background and shoot around 5-6 to create even more separation from the blurry background. Use a reflector to soften and control hard shadows. 8 points. Bearing the Summer Heat by Paula Buzinius. I like the subject matter of the photo, but it's difficult to get past the overprocessing. Work harder to get the image captured in camera rather than depending on fixing and repairing the images later in the computer. This is a difficult scene for the camera to meter properly, a subject moving through hard shadows under midday sun. One solution is to whip out the speedlight and try to fill the shadows, but fill flash is generally not effective past 12 feet or so, and in this situation, a flash is a no-no anyway out of consideration for your subject. The better solution is to do some dial turning on your 5D. Switch to manual exposure and spot metering. The 5D Mark II is a very nice camera with loads of specialized features to help you capture great images in less than optimum conditions. The idea is to get the best possible image in camera rather than to depend on the Photoshop crutch to prop up your images later. 8 points. Waiting by Susan Stageman. Lots of lines and colors leading to and from the prominent subject. I like how all the lines and colors lead my eye directly to the woman's face, then down to her shoes. Perhaps if shot from a lower angle to be more sympathetic to the woman and her situation. And of course I want to see more of her face, and a shallower depth of field would help isolate her from the background and the others waiting with her. 10 points. Carriage House Barn by Jay Hoppenstein. A simple, finely detailed image that is precisely composed with subtle software manipulation. I like the saturated greens and even tones produced under the cloudy sky. The greens in the center of the image are bordering on garish. Might want to tone that down just a bit. 11 points. Peterhof Cathedral by Kay Hale. The colorful cathedral is centered carefully within the window of the tree branches and leaves, backdropped by an almost brooding sky that adds depth and soft texture. The The image is rich in color and detail. I think a tighter crop with a more prominent cathedral centered low within the frame to crop out the building in the lower left of the image would be helpful. 11 points. Empty Stairwell by Suzanne Graham. I like the repetitive graphic look of the image and the deep blue hues on the outside structure. I'm just not a fan of fluorescent lighting, especially the way our cameras interpret the weird greenish-brown color output by the tubes. I think a much looser crop to make the deep blue hue of the dominant color and feature of the image would help. 11 points. Haystacks at Sunrise by Bob Johnson. I like that the image was made from a low angle, emphasizing the prominence of this big rock on the beach. There are quite a few dirty sensor dots scattered throughout the image. The dots are easily cleaned with Lightroom. There are also noticeable halos around the darker edges of the rock. 12 points. Farm Equipment by Dennis Fritchie. The strange and brilliant color is an eye-popper, nice composition, and wonderful detail found in the image. The image is over-sharpened just a bit, causing halos around the portions of the wheels. Each time I open this image, I feel a different reaction to the bright colors. Sometimes I like it, other times the image feels overdone. I think it looks great on a small screen, such as an iPad. It is simply overpowering on a larger screen. 12 points. Bus Rider in Santiago, Cuba. The lighting is very nice. I like the balance of the faces with the black background. The image makes me wonder what the woman is thinking. The edges of the window are almost a distraction. Although they form a natural frame for the image, I wonder if or how the mood of the image would change if the image was cropped in a bit. 12 points. Solitude by Jeff Glass. The layers of bland, lifeless sky and water add to the feeling of solitude. I like the dash of red and the way it leads my eyes straight to the woman in red on the beach. I suspect an out-of-focus, bland, lifeless sky and water would add even more to the feeling of solitude, further isolating the woman in red from the rest of the world. 12 points. Friendly Sunbather by Ronald Park. I like the lazy playfulness of the image. The details are sharp and clear. The exposure is handled nicely. Using an aperture of 2.8 has created separation between the subjects and the background. 12 points. Church on the Hill by Susan Burciaga. Nicely composed image, rich in detail and texture. Spots caused by a dirty sensor are easily cleaned in Lightroom. There are a few spots that need to be cleaned in this image. 12 points. Solid Colors by Houston Brown. Lovely exposure in this carefully composed image. I like the balance of color and details and the softness that the HDR process adds. The only improvement I might consider is correcting for the perspective of the upturned lens. This image probably could not have been captured without using HDR tools or image stacking. I recently warmed up to using HDR tools either in camera or in Photoshop or Lightroom. As I learn more about the process of shooting for HDR and the tools for building the image in the computer, I'm beginning to embrace the possibilities. 13 points. Old School by Kay Hargis. A well-crafted image with careful composition, color, and attention to detail. The lighting in the scene is well controlled. I'm enjoying the transition from cool blues and greens to the warm tones across the frame. Perhaps a tighter crop to eliminate the orphan shapes in the lower right of the image. 13 points. Butterfly by Steve Newman. Lovely color and saturation. The focal points of this image are just right, with the emphasis on the butterfly's eye and its feet along the edge of the leaf. The background is somewhat busy, and I think the image would be better with the tighter crop showing maybe only half of the leaf and putting the butterfly towards the lower thirds of the image. 13 points and honorable mention. Home Business in Camagüey, Cuba by Janie Rumberger. I really like this image. The colors are muted and subtle while the detail is crispy. I'm digging the lunchtime meal of the school kids and the faraway look of the woman behind the sewing machine. The exposure is nearly perfect. It's just a wee bit overexposed through horizontal middle of the frame. The white of the sewing machine could stand to be toned down a little. One of my all-time favorite books is Cuba by David Allen Harvey. I hope you've seen it, read it, and studied it. If you've not seen it, go get it now! 14 points in third place. Train Detail by Tina Arms. Very nice. The subtle hues and shades and crispy detail are beautiful. The composition is top-notch. I'd recommend cropping from the bottom of the image to a 3:2 ratio, leaving half of the background shadow area along the bottom of the image. 14 points in second place. Throwing Off the Chairs by Bill Nafee. The lighting is outstanding and very well controlled. The composition is tight, highlights into shadows are balanced, and I like the vignette. 14 points in first place. This image also receives the Judge's Choice Award for Projected Images.